Maya-chan had never considered herself brave or special in any way, and she had certainly never imagined that she would become the most terrifying human the galaxy had ever known. She was just a xenobiologist working on a space station that orbited a massive gas giant called Maradek 7, and her job was simple enough, as she spent most of her days cataloging alien plant samples and writing reports that nobody ever read. The Valorian Science Station was home to hundreds of alien species, and Maya had grown used to being the only human on board, as the other species watched her with curiosity and sometimes confusion. But she had made friends, and she had found her place among the stars on the day that changed everything. Maya was sitting in her small laboratory and staring at a sample of bioluminescent moss when the alarm started. Screaming red lights flashed across every wall, and a computerized voice announced that there had been a hull breach in the observation deck on level 7. And Maya felt her heart drop into her stomach, because she knew what was on level 7 today. Class of 23 Valkyrie younglings had gone there for a field trip to watch the storm swirling across the gas giant below, and Maya had seen them walking past her lab just an hour ago with their soft glowing skin and their big curious eyes and their tiny voices chattering with excitement. She ran out of her lab and into the main corridor, where she found chaos as dozens of Valkyrie adults stood frozen in place with their bioluminescent skin flickering in patterns of distress and fear. But none of them were moving toward the emergency lifts. Maya grabbed the arm of the nearest Valkyrie and asked what was happening and why nobody was going to help the children. The Valkyrie looked at her with wide, trembling eyes and explained that the observation deck had been sealed by emergency protocols, and that the rescue teams were calculating the safest approach, and that the council was deliberating on the proper response. Maya stared at him and felt something cold settle in her chest, because she understood now what she was seeing, as she had read about this in her xenobiology training, but she had never witnessed it firsthand. Valkyrie had evolved on a paradise world with no predators and no natural disasters and no real dangers of any kind, and their species had never developed the instinct to act in a crisis because they had never needed it. And so when faced with an emergency, they simply froze while their minds tried to process something they were not built to understand. Maya did not freeze. She ran to the emergency supply locker and grabbed a pressure suit and a plasma cutter and a first aid kit, and she shoved past the frozen Valkyrie and sprinted toward the emergency lift. A security officer called after her and said that she could not go to level 7 because the area had been sealed and the risk assessment had not been completed and the proper channels had not been followed. Maya did not stop, and she did not look back, and she did not care about proper channels because there were children trapped in a room that was running out of air. The lift took her to level 7, and she found the main corridor filled with emergency foam that had been sprayed to seal smaller breaches, and she pushed through it and followed the flashing red lights until she reached the sealed door that led to the observation deck. She could see through the small window in the door, and what she saw made her blood run cold. 23 small Valkyrie younglings were huddled together in the center of the room, and their glow was dimming as the oxygen levels dropped, and behind them she could see the massive viewport that looked out over the gas giant, and the viewport was cracked, and the cracks were spreading. Maya tried the door controls, but they were locked by emergency protocols that required authorization from the station council, and she tried to contact the council, but her communicator only gave her static, and she realized that she was completely alone. She looked around and spotted a maintenance hatch in the ceiling, and she knew where it led because she had studied the station blueprints during her first week on board, and the shaft would take her around the sealed door and into the observation deck through a ventilation access point. The problem was that the shaft ran right alongside the hull breach, and the sensors showed that it was venting atmosphere and filled with jagged metal and extreme cold. Maya climbed up anyway. The shaft was dark and narrow, and she had to crawl on her hands and knees, and within seconds, she could feel the cold seeping through her suit as the temperature dropped far below what her equipment was rated for. She kept crawling. A piece of torn metal sliced through her suit and into her arm, and her blood floated out in small red droplets that froze almost instantly in the vacuum-touched air. She kept crawling. Her fingers went numb, and her vision started to blur, and her lungs burned as the suit struggled to maintain pressure, and she could feel her own heartbeat slowing as her body began to shut down. She kept crawling, and then she saw a light ahead, and she pushed forward with the last of her strength, and she tumbled out of the ventilation access and landed hard on the floor of the observation deck. The Valkyrie younglings turned to look at her, and their eyes went wide with shock because they had never seen anything like her before, as she lay there bleeding and gasping with frost covering her skin and ice crystals forming in her hair. Maya pushed herself up onto her knees and looked at the children, and then looked at the cracked viewport behind them, and she saw that it was worse than she had feared, because the cracks were spreading faster now, and she could hear the glass groaning under the pressure. She had maybe 15 minutes to get them out, and she had no idea how she was going to do it, but she knew one thing with absolute certainty: she was not going to let these children die, not while she was still breathing. Maya forced herself to stand, even though her legs felt like they were made of water, and her injured arm screamed with pain every time she moved it. The 23 Valkyrie younglings stared at her with their huge luminous eyes, and she could see how scared they were, because their soft glow had faded to almost nothing, and their small bodies were trembling in the cold. One of them stepped forward, and it was the smallest of the group, with pale blue skin and big dark eyes, and it looked up at Maya and asked if she was the rescue team. Maya knelt down, so she was at eye level with the child, and she said yes, and she promised that she was going to get them all out of here. Behind her, the viewport groaned again, and a new crack appeared, spreading across the glass like a lightning bolt frozen in time. Maya stood and looked around the observation deck, searching for anything that could help her, and that was when she spotted the emergency evacuation pod in the far corner of the room. It was a cargo pod designed to carry sensitive equipment in case of emergency, and it was definitely not meant for passengers, but it was large enough to hold the children if they squeezed together, and it had its own life support system and enough air for several hours. The problem was the launch mechanism. Maya ran to the pod and checked the control panel, and her heart sank because the automatic launch system was offline, and the only way to activate the manual override was from the control station on the wall, and the control station was 10 meters away from the pod. Someone would have to stay behind to launch it. Maya closed her eyes for just a moment and took a deep breath, and then she opened them again and turned to face the children. With the calmest expression she could manage, she told them that they were going to play a game, and the game was called Sardines, and they all had to squeeze into the pod as tight as they could, and whoever fit the best would win. The younglings looked confused, but Maya was already herding them toward the pod and lifting the smaller ones inside and arranging them so they all fit, and she worked quickly because she could hear the viewport cracking more and more with each passing second. Her communicator suddenly crackled to life, and a voice came through, and it was Counselor Thelvine, the teacher who had been leading the field trip, and he was calling from somewhere safe on the station. He begged Maya to wait because the rescue team was almost ready, and the council had nearly finished their deliberations, and help was coming if she would just be patient. Maya kept loading children into the pod, and she told Thelvine that there was no time to wait because the viewport was failing and the children would be dead before his council finished their discussion. Shul's voice became desperate, and he said that she had to wait for the proper risk assessment because that was the protocol, and that was how things were done. Maya stopped what she was doing and spoke into the communicator with a voice that was quiet and steady and cold. She told him that she was not asking for permission. There was silence on the other end. The last youngling climbed into the pod, but it did not want to go, and It was the small one, with the pale blue skin, who had spoken to her first, and it clung to Maya's leg, and its glow began to pulse in rhythm. With her heartbeat, Maya recognized what was happening from her xenobiology studies, and it was called a bonding response, and it meant that the child had imprinted on her and saw her as a protector, and the thought of leaving her was causing it. Physical distress. Maya knelt down again, and she took the child's small face in her hands, and she looked into its dark eyes, and she told it that she needed it to be brave for just a little while longer. She told it that she was going to close the door, and then the pod was going to take them somewhere safe, and she told it that everything was going to be okay. The child asked if Maya was coming too. Maya smiled, and she lied, and she said, yes, of course she was coming too. She gently pried the child off her leg and placed it inside the pod with the others, and then she sealed the door, and she walked to the control station on the wall. Behind her, the viewport shattered. The emergency force field activated just in time to hold back the vacuum. But Maya could feel the temperature drop instantly, and she could feel the air being pulled toward the breach, and she knew the force field would only last for minutes at most. She slammed her hand on the manual override, and the pod launched, and she watched through the small window as it rocketed away from the station, carrying 23 small lives to safety. And then she was alone. The force field flickered, and Maya looked around desperately for anywhere she could shelter, and her eyes landed on a storage locker against the far wall that was meant for temperature-sensitive scientific samples. It was airtight, and it was small, and it was absolutely not meant for a person, but it was all she had. Maya ran to the locker and opened it and threw out the sample containers inside, and then she climbed in and pulled the door shut behind her just as the force field failed completely. The observation deck exploded outward into the void of space. Maya lay curled up in the tiny locker in complete darkness, and she could feel the cold seeping in through the walls, and she could feel her lungs struggling to find oxygen in the small amount of air trapped inside with her. She had maybe 4 minutes of breathable air, and no way to call for help, and no way to signal anyone. And she knew that she was probably going to die in this small, dark box, but the children were safe. Maya closed her eyes and focused on that thought as the cold wrapped around her, and her heartbeat slowed, and her consciousness began to fade. The children were safe, and that was all that mattered. That was enough. Maya woke up 11 days later in a bed that was too big for her, surrounded by medical equipment she did not recognize and soft lights that pulsed in colors she had no names for. For a long moment, she did not know where she was or what had happened. And then the memories came flooding back, and she sat up so fast that the medical monitors started screaming alarms of Volcari. Nurse rushed into the room and gently pushed her back down onto the bed and told her that she needed to rest because her body had been through a terrible ordeal. Maya grabbed the nurse's arm and asked about the children, and her voice came out as a harsh whisper because her throat was raw and dry. The nurse's skin flickered with a pattern Maya had learned to recognize as relief, and she told Maya that all 23 younglings had survived, and they were safe and healthy, and asking about her every single day. Maya let out a breath she felt like she had been holding for 11 days, and she sank back into the Pagis bed and stared at the ceiling, and let herself feel something other than fear for the first time since the alarms had started. Over the next few hours, Maya learned what had happened after she sealed herself in that storage locker. The rescue team had finally arrived and found the observation deck destroyed and open to space, and they had assumed that everyone inside was dead, and they had been about to leave when a junior technician noticed something strange on the thermal scanner. A tiny heat signature coming from a storage locker that was drifting among the debris. They had recovered the locker and opened it expecting to find damaged equipment, and instead they had found Maya curled up inside with frost covering her entire body, and no detectable heartbeat and skin that had turned blue from cold and oxygen deprivation. The Valkyrie doctors had declared her dead on the scene, but The human doctor stationed on the far side of the station had demanded they keep working, and she had explained that humans could survive things that would kill most other species, and she had talked them through a revival process that took 6 hours and required warming. Maya's body 1 degree at a time. Maya's core temperature had dropped to levels that should have killed her brain, and her blood oxygen had fallen to 4%, and by every measure, the Valkyrie knew she should have been completely and permanently dead. But humans were different. The human doctor had explained that Maya's body had entered something called metabolic suspension, where her systems shut down non-essential functions to keep her brain alive, and it was a survival mechanism that humans had evolved millions of years ago, and most humans did not even know they could do it. The Valkyrie were fascinated by this information. They were also deeply disturbed by it. Maya spent another week recovering in the medical bay, and during that time she noticed something strange about the way the station's inhabitants looked at her, and it was not the curiosity she was used to, and it was not the mild confusion that came with being the only human among thousands of aliens. It was fear. She learned why when Counselor Thelvine came to visit her on the 9th day of her recovery, and he stood in the doorway of her room for a long moment before he worked up the courage to enter. He carried a small box, which he presented to her with trembling hands, and inside was a medal that represented the highest honor the Valkyrie people could bestow, and he explained that the entire species had voted unanimously to give it to her. Maya thanked him and asked why he seemed so nervous, because they had spoken many times before, and he had always been friendly and warm. Thelvine sat down in the chair beside her bed, and his skin flickered through several different patterns before settling on something Maya did not recognize. Told her that he had watched the security footage. Maya said nothing and waited for him to continue. Thelvine explained that the entire galaxy had watched this security footage because someone had leaked it to the news networks, and it had spread across every inhabited world in a matter of hours. The footage showed Maya crawling through the maintenance shaft, with her suit torn and her blood freezing and her skin turning white with cold, and showed her refusing to stop even as her body was shutting down, and it showed her reaching the observation deck and standing up even though she should not have been able to stand. It showed her loading the children into the pod with hands that were literally frozen, and it showed her lying to the last child about coming with them, and it showed her sealing herself in a box that everyone watching knew would become her coffin. Thelvine looked at Maya with his huge eyes, and his skin flickered again, and he said the words that she would hear repeated across the galaxy for years to come. He said that she had not hesitated, and that was what frightened them. He explained that from the moment the alarm started to the moment she sealed herself in that locker, she had not stopped to calculate the risks, and she had not paused to assess the situation, and she had not frozen even for a second to process what was happening. She had simply acted. Maya told him that the children were in danger, and there was no time to think, and she just did what needed to be done. Thelvine shook his head slowly and told her that she did not understand, and that what she had done was impossible for his species and for most species in the galaxy. He told her that the Valkyrie had spent thousands of years developing protocols and risk assessments and proper channels, because that was how they stayed safe, and that was how they made decisions. But Maya had ignored all of that, and she had thrown herself into danger without any guarantee of survival, and she had kept going even when her body was dying. He asked her how she had done it, and his voice was barely a whisper. Maya thought about the question for a long moment, and then she answered honestly. She told him that she did not know, and she told him that she had not thought about it, and she told him that when she saw those children trapped and scared something inside her had simply switched on and taken over. And that was when Thelvine said the thing that made Maya realize how much her life had changed. He told her that his people had a word for creatures like her, and the word translated roughly to something beyond fear, and it was the same word they used for ancient predators and natural disasters and the cold. Void of space itself, Maya-chan had become something the galaxy did not have a category for. Human, who would die for strangers without being. And that was the most terrifying thing they had ever seen. 3 months after Maya-chan crawled through a maintenance shaft to save 23 alien children, she found herself standing in the largest room she had ever seen. Galactic Council chambers on Nexus Prime were built to impress and intimidate. And they succeeded on both counts, as Maya stood on a small platform in the center of a vast circular amphitheater, surrounded by rising tiers of seats, filled with representatives of 47 different species. She had expected this meeting to be some kind of award ceremony, and the message she received had mentioned recognition for her actions, and she had assumed that meant another medal or perhaps a formal thank you from the galactic community. She realized within the first 5 minutes that she had been very wrong. The being who spoke first was a tall insectoid creature called a coordinator, and it explained in a flat, mechanical voice that this gathering was not a celebration, but rather an assessment, and the subject of the assessment was humanity itself. Maya felt her stomach drop, but she kept her face calm and asked what exactly was being assessed. The coordinator activated a massive holographic display that filled the center of the chamber, and images began to appear showing humans throughout history engaging in what the coordinator called anomalous behavior. There were humans running into burning buildings to save strangers, and humans throwing themselves on grenades to protect their companions, and humans donating organs to people they had never met, and humans working themselves to death for causes that would never benefit them personally. The coordinator explained that the council had been studying human behavior since first contact, and they had found patterns that did not match any other known species in the galaxy. Humans did not freeze in crisis situations, but instead experienced something called the fight or flight response that actually increased their physical capabilities when threatened. Humans had a chemical called adrenaline that made them stronger and faster when they were injured or afraid. Humans could survive wounds that would kill any other species and could continue functioning with damage that should have been immediately fatal. And most disturbing of all, humans had a documented tendency to sacrifice themselves for others, including complete strangers and even members of other species. The coordinator turned to face Maya directly and said that her actions on the Valorian science station had accelerated the council's concerns and forced them to move up this assessment by several decades. Maya asked what exactly the council was concerned about, because from where she stood it seemed like saving children should be considered a good thing. A new voice spoke from the upper tiers, and it belonged to a creature Maya recognized as a Kreth, which was a species of calculating predators known throughout the galaxy for their cold logic and brutal efficiency. The Kreth representative rose from his seat, and his scales gleamed under the chamber lights as he descended toward the central platform. He explained that the council was not afraid of human weapons because weapons could be countered, and they were not afraid of human technology because technology could be matched. What the council feared was human psychology. The Kreth stopped a few meters from Maya and looked down at her with eyes that held no warmth and no emotion. He asked her a simple question, and the question was this: what do you threaten a human with when they do not value their own lives? Maya met his gaze and did not look away, and she told him that he had misunderstood completely. The Kreth made a sound that might have been laughter, and he said that the evidence was clear because she had sealed herself in a box and waited to die for children who were not even her own species, and that did not suggest someone who valued their life very highly. Maya shook her head and told him that was exactly backwards. She explained that humans valued their lives enormously, and that was precisely why what she did mattered, because it was not meaningless to her, and it was not easy, and it was not some automatic response that she had no control over. She had known exactly what she was doing, and she had known exactly what it would cost, and she had done it anyway. The Kreth asked why, and there was something in his voice that might have been genuine curiosity, Maya looked around the vast chamber at the dozens of species, watching her, and she thought about how to explain something that seemed so obvious to her, but was apparently incomprehensible to everyone else. She told them about a concept humans called empathy, and she explained that it meant feeling what others feel, and that when she saw those children huddled together with their lights fading and their eyes full of fear, she felt their fear as if it was her own. She told them that humans were not brave because they did not feel afraid, but rather they were brave because they felt afraid, and they acted anyway. She told them that the reason she did not hesitate was not because she did not care about herself, but because in that moment she cared about those children more. The Creth stared at her for a long moment, and then he asked the question that silenced the entire chamber. He asked what would happen if someone threatened the things humans cared about. Maya looked at him, and she answered honestly. She told him that if someone threatened her children or her family or her friends or her home, then she would not stop, and she would not rest, and she would not die until the threat was ended. She told him that humans did not have claws or scales or venom, and they were small and fragile and short-lived compared to most species in the galaxy. But she told him that the most dangerous thing in the universe was not a predator with sharp teeth, and it was not a warship with powerful weapons, and it was not even a species with superior technology. Most dangerous thing in the universe was a human with someone to protect. The chamber was silent for a very long time. Then the coordinator spoke again and announced that the council would now vote on the classification of humanity. Maya stood alone on her platform and watched as 47 species decided the fate of her kind. Vote was unanimous. Humanity was classified as a guardian species, which meant they were not a threat to be contained, but a force to be respected, and yes, feared, because a species that would walk through fire for strangers was capable of absolutely anything. Maya Chen left the council chambers that day as something more than a xenobiologist and something more than a survivor. She left as the face of humanity, and the galaxy would never look in her species the same way again. 10 years had passed since Maya Chen crawled through a maintenance shaft to save 23 children who were not her own, and in that time, everything had changed. She never returned to her quiet life as a xenobiologist, cataloging samples and writing reports that nobody read, and instead she became the first human ambassador to the Galactic Council because the galaxy needed a face for humanity, and they chose the woman who had shown them exactly what humans were capable of. Maya had not wanted the position at first, and she had argued that she was just a scientist and not a diplomat, but the council had insisted, and eventually she had accepted because she realized that someone needed to help the galaxy understand her species, and the galaxy needed a lot of help understanding humans in the decades since the incident on the Valorian Science Station. Stories about humans had spread to every corner of known space, and some of them were true, and some of them were exaggerated, and some of them were completely made up, but all of them pointed to the same terrifying conclusion: humans were not like other species. There was the story of the human mining crew on Theta Station, who had held a collapsing tunnel for 6 hours with nothing but their bodies and makeshift supports so that their co-workers could escape, and 4 of them had died, but 37 others had lived. There was the story of the human doctor on a colony ship who had performed surgery on herself to remove her own appendix because she wanted to save the ship's limited medical supplies for her patients, and she had stayed awake through the entire procedure using only local anesthetic. And a mirror, there was the story of the human soldier during the border conflicts who had walked into a radiation zone to carry out survivors one by one, and his body had absorbed lethal doses with each trip, but he kept going back, and he made 19 trips before his legs gave out, and even then he tried to crawl back for a 20th. The galaxy did not know what to make of these stories, and some species admired humanity, and some feared them, and some thought they were simply insane, but everyone agreed on one thing: You did not want to be the enemy of a human who had someone to protect. Maya thought about all of this as her ship descended through the atmosphere of the Valkyrie homeworld on the 10th anniversary of the rescue. The planet was beautiful, with vast forests of bioluminescent trees and oceans that glowed with the light of billions of tiny organisms and cities that rose like crystalline sculptures toward the purple sky. She had been invited to attend a ceremony honoring the anniversary, and she had accepted even though she was not comfortable with celebrations that focused on her and what she had done. The shuttle landed in the capital city, and Maya was escorted through streets lined with Valkyrie, who watched her pass with expressions she could not quite read. They brought her to a great hall filled with thousands of Valkyrie, and as she entered, the crowd parted to create a path to the center of the room. Standing at the end of that path were 23 young Valkyrie adults who had once been the frightened children she carried to safety. Maya recognized them immediately, even though they had grown tall and elegant, and their bioluminescence had developed the complex patterns of maturity. One of them stepped forward, and Maya knew who it was before she even saw the face, because she would have recognized that pale blue skin anywhere. It was Sylvine, the small child who had bonded to her, and who she had lied to when she promised she would be coming with them in the pod. Sylvine had grown into a striking adult with a long, graceful neck and eyes that still held the same curious warmth they had held 10 years ago. Maya and Sylvine stood facing each other in the center of the great hall, and neither of them spoke for a long moment. Then Sylvine reached out and took Maya's hands in theirs, and their skin began to glow in a pattern that Maya recognized as the deepest form of Valkyrie gratitude. Sylvan spoke in a voice that carried to every corner of the hall, and they said that on behalf of the 23 who were saved, and on behalf of all Valkyrie, they wished to present Maya Chen with the highest honor their species could bestow. They placed a glowing crystal around Maya's neck, and it pulsed with light that matched Maya's own heartbeat, just as Sylvine's light had matched it 10 years ago. But then Sylvine spoke again, and their words were not part of the ceremony, and they were not rehearsed, and they came from somewhere deep and honest. They told Maya that the 23 who were saved had formed an organization called the Debt, and they had dedicated their lives to helping other species the way Maya had helped them. They told her that the Debt had spread across the galaxy and now included members of dozens of species, all working together to save lives and protect the innocent. They told her that everything they had become and everything they had done was because of her. And then Sylvine said something that made Maya's eyes fill with tears. They said that in the decades since the rescue, they had studied humans extensively, and they had learned about human wars and human cruelty and humanity's capacity for destruction and violence, but they kept returning to the same conclusion over and over again. Maya asked what that conclusion was. Sylvine smiled, which was something Valkyrie had only learned to do after meeting humans, and they answered, "The most dangerous thing about humanity is how much you are willing to love." Maya could not speak, and so she simply pulled Sylvine into an embrace, which was a human gesture that the Valkyrie had also learned to appreciate. Later that night, Maya sat alone on a balcony overlooking the glowing forests of the Valkyrie homeworld, and she thought about everything that had happened since that day on the space station. She had become famous throughout the galaxy, and she had become feared and respected and admired, and she had helped change the way every species thought about humanity. But when she closed her eyes, she did not think about any of that. She thought about 23 small, frightened children with fading lights, and she thought about the choice she had made without even thinking about it. And she knew she would make the same choice again across the galaxy in 100 different ports and stations and worlds. Children of every species were learning the same bedtime story that night. It was the story of a small, fragile creature from a small, fragile world who had walked through fire and ice and vacuum for children who were not her own. The story always ended the same way, and that is why, little one, you should never threaten a human's friends, because Humans do not calculate odds, and they do not measure risk, and they do not ask permission. They just act, and there is nothing in the universe more terrifying than a species that will die for you without being asked. Maya Chun had become the most feared human in the galaxy, not because she was strong, not because she was powerful, but because she had shown the universe exactly how far a human would go for love, and the universe had never been quite the same.